Persuasion by Jane Austen. Chapter 19. While Admiral Croft was taking this walk with Anne, and expressing his wish of getting Captain Wentworth the bath, Captain Wentworth was already on his way thither. Before Mrs. Croft had arrived, he was arrived, and the very next time Anne had walked out, she had saw him. Mr. Elliot was attending his two cousins and Mrs. Clay. They were in Milsom Street, and it began to rain. Not much, but enough to make a shelter desirable for the woman, and quite enough to make it very desirable for Miss Elliot to have the advantage of being conveyed home in Lady Dalrymple's carriage, which was waiting at a little distance. She, Anne, and Mrs. Clay therefore turned into Mollans, while Mr. Elliot stepped to Lady Dalrymple to request her assistance. He soon joined them again. Successful, of course, Lady Dalrymple would be most happy to take them home, and would call for them in a few minutes. Her ladyship's carriage was about barouche, and did not hold more than four with any comfort. Mrs. Carteret was with her mother, and consequently was not reasonable to expect accommodation for all three of the Camden Place ladies. There'd be no doubt as to Miss Elliot, who suffered inconvenience. She must suffer none, but it occupied a little time to settle the point of civility between the other two. The rain was a mere trifle, and Anne was the most sincere in preferring a walk with Mr. Elliot. But the rain was also a mere trifle to Mrs. Clay. She was she would hardly allow it to even drop at all, and her boots were so thick, much thicker than Miss Anne's, and, in short, her civility rendered her quite as anxious to be left to walk with Mr. Elliot as Anne could be. It was discussed between them with a generosity so polite and so determined that the others were obliged to settle it for them. Miss Elliot maintaining that Mrs. Clay had a little cold already, and Mr. Elliot was deciding on appeal that his cousin Anne's boots were rather the thickest. It was fixed accordingly, and that Mrs. Clay should be a party in the carriage, and they should reach this point when Anne, as she sat near a window, descried, most decidedly and distinctly, Captain Wentworth walking down the street. Her start was perceptible only to herself, but she instantly felt that she was the greatest simpleton in the world, and the most unaccountable and absurd. For the few minutes she saw nothing before her. It was all confusion. She was lost. When she had scolded back to her senses, she had found the others still waiting for the carriage. Mr. Elliot, always obliging, was setting off for the Union Street on a commission for Mrs. Clay. Now she felt a great inclination to go the outer door. She wanted to see if it rained. Why was she expecting herself of another motive? Captain Wentworth must be out of sight, and she left her seat. She would go, and one half of her would not always be so much wiser than the other half, always suspecting the other of being worse than it is. She would see if it rained. She was sent back, however, in the moment by the entrance of Captain Wentworth himself, among a party of gentlemen and ladies, evidently his acquaintance, whom he had joined a little below Milsom Street. He was more obviously struck and confused by the sight of her than she had ever observed. He looked quite red, and for the first time since their renewed acquaintance, she felt that she was betraying the least sensibility of the two. She had the advantage of him in preparation for the last few moments. All the overpowering, blinding, bewildering first effects of strong surprise were over with her. However, she still had enough to feel. It was an agitation, pain, pleasure, a something between delight and misery. After a short she spoke to her, and then turned away, and the character of this manner was embarrassment. She could not call it either cold or friendly, or anything so certainly as embarrassed. After a short interval, however, which he came towards her and spoke again, their mutual inquiries on the common subject passed, and neither of them possibly much the wiser for what they heard. And Anne, continuing sensibly over being less at ease than formerly, they dint on being so very much together, and got to speak to each other with a considerable portion of apparent differences and calmness. But he could not do it now. The time had changed him, or Louisa had changed him. There was a consciousness of some sort of the other. He looked very well, and not as if he had been suffering in health or spirits. He talked of Uppercross, the Mungroves, nay, even of Louisa, who gave a momentary look of his own arch significance as he named her. But yet it was Captain Wentworth not comfortable, not easy, not able to feign that he was. It did not surprise, but it grieved Anne to observe that Elizabeth would not know him. She saw that he saw Elizabeth, that Elizabeth saw him, that there was a complete internal recognition on each side. She was convinced that he was ready to be acknowledged as an acquaintance, expecting it, that she had seen the pain of seeing her sister turn away with unalterable coldness. Lady Dalrymple's carriage, for which Miss Elliot was growing very impatient, now drew up, and the servant came to announce it. It began to rain, and although there was a delay, the bustle of talking which made the all little crowd in the shop understand that Lady Dalrymple was calling to convey Miss Elliot. At last, Miss Elliot and her friend, unattended but by the servant, for there was no cousin, returned, were walking off, and Captain Wentworth, watching them, turned to Anne, and by the manner rather than the words was offering service to her. "I'm much obliged to you," was her answer, "but I am not going with them. The carriage will not accommodate so many, and I prefer walking." "But it rains." "Oh, very little, nothing in that regard." After a moment's pause, he said, "Though I only came yesterday, and I've equipped myself properly for a bath already, you see," pointing to a new umbrella. "I wish you would make use of it if you are determined to walk, though I think it would be more prudent to let me go get you a chair." She was very much obliged to him, but declined it all, repeating her conviction that the rain would come nothing to the present uh, to come nothing, and adding, "I am only waiting for Mr. Elliot. He will be here in a moment, I am sure." She had hardly spoken the words when Mr. Elliot walked in. Captain Wentworth recollected himself perfectly. There was no difference between him and the man who had stood on the steps at Lyme, admiring Anne as she passed, except the air and look and the manner of the privileged relation and friend. He came in with eagerness, and appeared to see that think only of her, apologized for his stay, she was grieving to have kept her waiting, and anxious to get her away, without further loss of time, and before the rain ceased. In another moment they had walked off together. She had under his a gentle embarrassed glance, and a "good morning to you," being all after she had time for, as she passed away. As soon as they were out of sight, the ladies of Captain Wentworth's party began talking to them. "Mr. Elliot does not dislike his cousin, I fancy." "Oh, no, that is clear enough. One can guess what will happen here. He is always with them. Half lives in the family, I believe. What a very good-looking man. Yes, and Miss Atkins, who dined with him once at Wallace, says he's the most agreeable man that she was ever in company with. She is pretty, I think. Anne Elliot's very pretty, when one comes to look at her. It is not the fashion to say so, but I confess I admire her more than her sister." "Oh, so do I, and so do I. No comparison. But the men are all wild after Miss Elliot. Anne is too delicate for them." Anne would have been particularly obliged to her cousin if he would walk by her side and all the way to Camden Place, and without saying a word, she had never found it so difficult to listen to him, though nothing could exceed his solitude and care, but though his subjects were principally such as were wont was always be interesting. Praise, warmth, and just, and discriminating, of Lady Russell, and insinuations highly rational against Mrs. Clay. But now she could only think of Captain Wentworth, and could not understand his present feelings, whether he was really suffering from much disappointment or not. To that point were settled. She could not quite be herself. She hoped to be wise and reasonable at the time, but alas, alas, she must confess to herself that she was not wise, and yet another circumstance, very essential to her, for her to know, was how long he meant to be in Bath. He had not mentioned it, or she could not recollect it. She might be the only one passing through, but it was more probable that he should be come to stay. In that case, so liable as everybody to meet everybody in Bath, Lady Russell would in all likelihood see him somewhere. Would she recollect him? How would it all be? She had already been obliged to tell Lady Russell that Louisa Munro was to marry Captain Benwick. It cost her something to encounter Lady Russell's surprise, and if now she were by any chance being thrown into the company of Captain Wentworth, her imperfect knowledge of the matter might add another shade to prejudice against him. The following morning Anne was out with her friend, and for the first hour in incessant or fearful sort of watch for him in vain. But at last, in returning down to Pullany Street, she distinguished him on the right-hand pavement at such a distance as to have him to view in a greater part of the street. There were many other men about him, many groups walking in the same way, but there was no mistaking him. She looked instinctively at Lady Russell, and not from any mad idea of her recognizing him as so soon as she did herself. No, it was not to be supposed that Lady Russell would perceive him till they were nearly the opposite. She looked at her, however, from time to time anxiously when the moment approached which must be the point direction for him. Or being, in short, intently observed, she could not thoroughly comprehend what sort of fascination must possess over Lady Russell's mind. The difficulty it must for her to withdraw her eyes, the astonishment that she must be feeling that 8 or 9 years that she should have passed over him, and in the foreign climes and active service too, without robbing him of one's personal grace. At last Lady Russell drew her head back. Now, how would she speak of him? "You will wonder," said she, "what has been fixing my eye on so long, but I was looking at the window curtains, where Lady Alicia and Mrs. Frankland was telling me of last night. They had described the drawing-room curtains of one of the houses on the sides, and this part of the street has been the handsomest and best hung in any Bath. But she could not recollect the exact number, and I've been trying to find out which it could be. But I confess that I can see no curtains hereabout that answer to the description." Anne sighed, blushed, and smiled, in pity and disdain, and either at her friend or herself. The part which provoked her the most was that in all this waste in foresight, caution, she could have lost the right moment of seeing whether he saw them. A day or two passed without producing anything, the theatres or the rooms, or where she was most likely to be. There were not fashionable enough of the Elliots, whose evening amusements were solely in the elegant stupidity of private parties, which they were quite getting more and more engaged. Like Anne, wearied of such a state of stagnation, sick of knowing nothing, and fancying herself stronger because strength was not tried, was quite impatient for the concert evening. It was a concert for the benefit of a person patronized by Lady Dalrymple, for of course they must attend. It was really expected to be a good one, and Captain Wentworth was very fond of music. If she could only have a few minutes' conversation with him again, she would have fancied she would be satisfied. As to the power of addressing him, she felt all the courage and opportunity occurred. Elizabeth had turned from him, Lady Russell overlooked him. Her nerves were strengthened by these circumstances, and she felt that she owed him attention. She had once partly promised Mrs. Smith to spend an evening with her, but in all short calls she excused herself, put it off with a more decided promise of a longer visit. On the morrow Mrs. Smith gave a most good-humoured acquiescence. "By all means," said she. "Only tell me all about it. When do you come? Who is your party?" Anne named them all. Mrs. Smith made no reply, but she was leaving her said, and, with an expression half serious, half arch, "Well, I heartily wish your concert may answer, and do not fail me tomorrow if you can come, for I begin to have a foreboding that may not have many more visits from you." Anne was startled and confused, and after standing in a moment's suspense, was obliged, and not sorry to obliged, to hurry away.